Welcome to this webinar introducing the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition for Deforestation and Conversion-Free Beef, brought to you by the Forest Positive Coalition with support from ProForest. The objectives of this webinar are for key users of the Forest Positive Coalition's DCF Methodology for Beef to learn more about the approach and to improve their ability to support FPC member reporting on DCF. Begin with some brief background of the Forest Positive Coalition commitments, action, and accountability before a deep dive into the DCF methodologies. The Forest Positive Coalition is composed of 22 leading manufacturers and retailers committed to driving collective transformative change to remove deforestation, forest conversion, and degradation from key commodity supply chains. In this work, the coalition is supported by the Tropical Forest Alliance and ProForest. To deliver this forest positive ambition, the coalition has a three-pronged approach across own-sourced volumes, working with suppliers, and addressing systemic issues in production landscapes through collaborative approaches. These actions are underpinned by transparency and accountability. The theory of change is operationalized by roadmaps for the 4 coalition commodities, which are cattle-derived products, palm oil, soy, and pulp paper and fiber-based packaging. These roadmaps each have 5 elements of the forest positive approach, which are managing own supply chains, working with suppliers, monitoring the production base, engaging in production landscapes, and transparency and accountability. For each of these 5 elements, the roadmap specifies individual member and collective company commitments, actions, and KPIs, on which the coalition companies publicly report on an annual basis. To support the implementation of the roadmaps, the coalition has published a series of resources, which include roadmap implementation guidance, guidance for suppliers who would like to know more about how to become forest positive businesses, and also a palm oil monitoring and response framework. These are all readily available on the Consumer Goods Forum website. Next, we'll deep dive into the 2 roadmap elements most linked to the topic of this webinar, which is deforestation and conversion-free methodologies. Element 1 of each of the 4 commodity roadmaps covers members' own supply chain and volume sourcing, which includes a commitment to be deforestation and conversion-free across commodity business. For this commitment, there's a corresponding KPI to track progress to DCF using an aligned methodology and understanding of commodity scope. This KPI is reported on each year by member companies through the coalition's annual report. DCF for own volumes is not enough for sectoral transformation. Therefore, element 2 of each roadmap covers expectations for member suppliers to be forest positive across the supplier's commodity business, not just for volume support sourced by the coalition companies. Through the roadmaps, the companies are committed to communicating and implementing the forest positive approach with suppliers, including through collaboration to address shared sectoral challenges. As with element 1, there's also a KPI for members to report on this supplier engagement. Next, we will understand the cross-commodity DCF methodology, which forms the basis for each of the commodity-specific methodologies.
Talking about how this was developed and also some of the underlying principles. So first, to note, the methodology was developed with the coalition, but also in consultation with key partners. This includes the Accountability Framework Initiative, CDP, and also TRACE. One of the core principles in the development of the methodology was in achieving alignment and an aligned approach to DCF that allows companies to report in a way that is both consistent but also credible across the coalition, but also with the wider sector. And the intention is that by socializing the methodology, there is wider uptake of this methodology kind of beyond the coalition across the sector too. It's also important to note that there is a commitment to transparency in the coalition, including reporting on DCF. And the intention is that coalition suppliers are also able to uptake these same principles in terms of public reporting and transparency. So moving on to the basic principles of the generic DCF methodology. First, we're going to talk through the key steps that build up the methodology and the several different implementation options and what this means for different kinds of businesses. So first, we have these three key steps within the methodology. The first being able to trace back to a production unit at a scale needed to confirm the status. So this depends on the context that we're talking about. And we'll talk about those commodity-specific components as we go through the methodology. Secondly, confirming that there's been no deforestation after the cutoff date. And finally, being able to monitor the remaining vegetation and also effectively respond to any new deforestation or conversion in the future. So there's several different ways of implementing those three steps through different implementation options, which we'll now walk through. So the first implementation option A, is through certification under an acceptable scheme and chain of custody. Within certification, this includes those three steps that we just walked through. So there's a stage at which there's traceability, there's a certifier on the ground who can verify where the volumes came from. There's then also these stages of monitoring and checking that information. Implementation option B includes area level monitoring. This has also been referred to as negligible risk in the sector, though generally the sectoral aligned language that we use is area level monitoring. This relates to geographic areas at different scales depending on the commodity context, where there is little to no deforestation or conversion. And so a specific geographic area can be considered negligible risk or minimal risk. Implementation option C includes remote monitoring. So this might be through remote monitoring platforms where you have traceability and you can check that there's been no deforestation or conversion in that area. And finally, as opposed to remote monitoring, this could also be done through an on-the-ground field assessment. It's important to note out that these different implementation options may be more or less used depending on the commodity context, and that's something that we will be going through as you go through the material. These implementation options are most relevant for upstream companies or companies where there's good access to robust traceability information. In a context where there's limited traceability information to a production area, a company, particularly those further downstream, might be more reliant on their suppliers in being able to access this information about the deforestation and conversion-free status of their volumes. In that case, we might talk about implementation options E. So this is where you check that your supplier has an effective DCF control mechanism. And all that really means is that you're ensuring that your supplier is implementing a combination of A, B, C, or D that is effectively addressing deforestation and conversion and the risks associated with that in the supply chain. So we're now going to be walking through the commodity-specific interpretations of this generic methodology. These have been adapted for each of the 4 Forest Positive Coalition commodities: palm oil, soy, pulp paper and fiber-based packaging, and cattle-derived products. And all of these methodologies build off the fundamental principles which have been presented in that generic DCF methodology.
The Forest Positive Coalition's DCF methodology for beef. However, every time I say beef, you can understand cattle-derived products, which is the scope of the CGF FPC Beef Working Group. Firstly, it's important to note that, as with all the commodities, the beef methodology is strongly built on the generic DCF methodology, which has been presented. What you can see here in the screen is key generic implementation options to assess that there was no deforestation nor conversion related to beef volumes after a determined cutoff date. Those are several different ways and implementation options that a company might use. In this video, we will be talking through the different implementation options in the context of beef, considering which are more relevant in this commodity-specific context. For beef, implementation options B, E, and C are the most relevant as they are most widely used. Volume traceability is very important for the assurance of DCF, deforestation and conversion-free claims. The Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition Beef Working Group has defined non-origin as the country of slaughter for non-negligible risk countries. In other words, for countries in which cattle production have negligible risk of being linked to deforestation and conversion, and the slaughterhouse location as non-origin for other countries. Therefore, the methodology presented in the next slides follow this definition to support the DCF estimation of volumes. The flow of the implementation options we propose here are based on their implementation difficulties. In our beef roadmap guidance, the three options on your screen are called A, B, and C. But in order to make it clear with the generic methodology just presented, we will call them B, E, and C. Option B, area level monitoring, previously referred as negligible risk origin. As a first step, members should know the country of slaughter of 100% of its volumes, so they can assess whether the country is a DCF country. In other words, that the country has negligible risk of deforestation and conversion linked to cattle, or an at-risk country. If the country is classified as DCF according to the methodology adopted by the coalition or the company's own methodology, then volumes coming from that country can be classified as DCF. If the country is not classified as DCF, it is necessary to assess whether traceability has been achieved to an administrative area with an insignificant risk of deforestation and conversion. If so, that volume can be considered DCF. Option E, supplier with DCF control mechanism. The next implementation option involves assessing whether the supplier has a DCF control mechanism. If such mechanism is in place and ensures that volumes are DCF, then volume source from that supplier may be classified as such. Option C, farm level assessment. A third common option is to conduct a farm level assessment via satellite images. In this case, you should collect information with your supplier, on their suppliers, and hire a service provider to assess compliance with the CGF FPC DCF elements via remote assessment. If compliance is identified, then the volume can be considered DCF. Otherwise, it cannot. Furthermore, the cutoff dates used by the coalition seek to be aligned with the legal cutoff dates, sectoral cutoff dates where they exist, such as Brazilian Amazon and Cerrado biomes, and initiatives such as GTFI, the Indirect Cattle Suppliers Working Group. Now, we go a bit more in the details of each implementation option. The implementation options relevant to the meat context is option B, area level monitoring, which was previously known as negligible risk approach. Coalition members should trace products back to the origin needed to confirm DCF status, ideally to the country or subnational level where deforestation and conversion risk is considered negligible. To support this, TRACE, together with AFI Secretariat and Proforest, developed a methodology that classifies countries as either negligible risk country or at-risk country based on cattle-linked deforestation and conversion. This method uses a 5% global deforestation threshold and is already available to the coalition members, even though it will be publicly released in 2025. Companies are encouraged to use this list to make DCF claims. For those aiming for stronger commitments, a 1% threshold can be adopted. If a country is classified as at risk, further analysis can be done to reclassify it, as long as data sources and methods are transparently shared. In these cases, members can go deeper, tracing products to more specific levels, like subnational regions or even individual farms, as long as they clearly disclose how far traceability goes for their claims. The methodology that classifies countries developed for the coalition is not yet public. Some information are important to share. The analysis uses several key data sets. The DCF 2024, which tracks global cattle-related deforestation in 2020, EOCD data from 2019, covering ecosystem conversion to agriculture between 2004 and 2019, and FAO data from 2022 on cattle production and exports between 2016 and 2020. Based on this data, countries were classified into two groups. 132 countries are considered negligible risk countries for deforestation and conversion related to cattle production, and 39 countries are considered at-risk countries for deforestation and conversion. The countries identified as priorities for action by the coalition members fall within these at-risk countries. As can be seen in the decision tree, data on conversion of non-forest natural ecosystem to planted pasture is not covered by the datasets. To address these and other gaps, two safeguards were included in the decision tree. One in cattle deforestation intensity. The country's cattle deforestation intensity, cattle deforestation divided by cattle production. This safeguard protects against countries with low cattle production and pasture with high relative rates of cattle pasture deforestation being classified as DCF. 2. Conversion risk. The country's ecosystem conversion for agricultural use relative to global ecosystem conversion for agricultural use, OECD, and cattle production relative to global cattle deforestation, FAO. The risk was determined based on benchmarking and ranking countries from highest to lowest regarding its contribution to global ecosystem conversion for agricultural use and applying a threshold. Therefore, countries that make all the way down the decision tree have negligible risk of both deforestation and conversion to cattle production. Traceability information is what can support companies for their DCF claims under area level monitoring. You can first ask your suppliers the country of slaughter of the volumes you source. If the country is negligible risk according to the FPC methodology guidance, no further information is needed. If the country is at risk, or in other words, non-negligible, you should get information on the slaughterhouse location, which, as already explained, was defined as what the Beef Working Group considered as non-origin, and assess in a similar methodology if the volumes from that location can be classified as negligible risk. Of course, ideally and in alignment to where the FPC wants to get, FPC companies would be getting full traceability of their volumes up to birth farm, and all these farm locations would be assessed against the risk of deforestation and conversion for their DCF claims under area level monitoring. FPC companies are expected to be transparent on their level of traceability when they have for their DCF claims and are encouraged to advance on further traceability. The implementation option of the FPC DCF methodology for beef is suppliers with DCF control mechanisms. This is a relevant solution for downstream actors who have limited access to robust data on traceability in the production area. In this case, companies should verify that meat packers have a control mechanism, such as a purchase control system, that ensures the volume sourced is DCF. This control mechanism should align with the Amazon and Cerrado protocols. Both protocols require establishing a purchase control system to suspend non-compliant cattle suppliers. Meat packers are also encouraged to make independent audits of their purchase control systems publicly available and to provide evidence of DCF when possible. Additionally, as outlined in the guidance for forest positive suppliers of cattle-derived products, meat packers are expected to maintain regular engagement with producers, develop mechanisms to identify and address non-compliances, and support initiatives that promote forest positive development at landscape and sectoral levels. In summary, this DCF option allows FPC members to classify volumes coming from a determined supplier as DCF once the supplier has a DCF control mechanism in place. For this DCF solution, FPC companies can ask that suppliers have a DCF control mechanism in place that cover the criteria on the screen, which we will present again in more details in the following slide. Moreover, it is best practice that companies to request evidence from suppliers to support DCF volumes. Regarding implementation option C, related to remote assessment, what the coalition states is that when the risk is not negligible and the supplier or meat packer has no DCF control mechanism in place, coalition members should conduct their own farm level assessment to verify that the sourced volumes are indeed DCF, which requires traceability to the farm level. The assessment should follow the monitoring protocol for cattle suppliers in the Amazon and the voluntary monitoring protocol for cattle suppliers in the Cerrado. For remote DCF assessment to support a claim, companies need to verify that all key criteria stated by the coalition are being followed. Conversion of any type of natural ecosystem is considered. Both illegal and legal conversion is considered. Regarding the cutoff date, for Brazilian Amazon and Cerrado, there is the need to be aligned with the guidance for meat packers or earlier cutoff dates. For other biomes and countries, 2020 is the latest cutoff date accepted. There is the need to include legal compliance in the assessment and the understanding that the assessed unit is the whole farm and not only the production area. And finally, the respect for indigenous and quilombolas lands and no slave labor need to be considered. In order to be able to conduct a farm-level assessment, FPC companies may need to ask their suppliers some key information, such as the farm location, both the geolocation and the full address, if possible, the car number, CAR in Brazil is the Environmental Registry of the Farm, a mandatory document in which you can find the boundaries of the farm, water bodies information, and existing native vegetation, among other environmental information, or any equivalent document available in other countries, and an animal transit guide, which in Brazil is known as GTA, in which it is documented the trade between the supplier and buyer that can confirm the sourcing information and provide more details in terms of volume sourced. Finally, you may also ask your suppliers the property owner's identification number. Again, in Brazil, we use CPF, an individual taxpayer identification number, and CNPJ, which is the corporate taxpayer identification number. Therefore, beyond the remote assessment of the farm, you can also check any embargo or slave list in public datasets. Although implementation options A and D are not as relevant to the beef context, it is important to make a few brief notes about them. Regarding the certification option, currently there is no widely recognized, standardized, and consolidated certification system for the cattle supply chain, unlike other agricultural commodities. In beef production, this lack of a globally accepted robust certification limits the use of certification as a practical option for DCF sourcing. However, the cattle sector relies on complementary initiatives, technical guidance tools, and sustainability frameworks that, while not formal certifications, offer meaningful and practical pathways to implement sustainability commitments within the supply chain. The monitoring protocols set out technical criteria on social and environmental monitoring of direct cattle suppliers with guidance on reintegration rules. The first one on the screen, the Voluntary Monitoring Protocol for Cattle Suppliers in the Cerrado, is a voluntary and multi-stakeholder initiative that incorporates native vegetation conversion monitoring, cut-off dates, and action plans for supplier regularization. Meanwhile, the monitoring protocol for cattle suppliers in the Amazon was the first one developed and is widely used by meatpackers to comply with the terms of adjustment of conduct in the Amazon region. The Indirect Suppliers Working Group, GTFI, brings together various stakeholders in Brazil to discuss solutions for traceability, monitoring, and transparency with a focus on deforestation by indirect cattle suppliers. Recently, the GTFI has published a stepwise approach and timelines to guide the implementation of social environmental criteria to indirect cattle suppliers. Again, these are not certification options for DCF claims according to the FPC methodology, but some beef initiatives that may define criteria, guidance, and structured pathways towards building a more sustainable supply chain. Lastly, the implementation option D on field assessment is not very feasible to the cattle sector due to the complexity of the supply chain with multiple farms involved in a single cattle lifespan and lack of traceability information on suppliers. This added to the fact that this is likely the most expensive implementation option as it requires field visits to farms, makes it a not common or feasible solution at large scale. Now that you know the implementation options for DCF beef and therefore elements you should consider when purchasing beef volumes, it's important to highlight why this matters for the coalition members and how this information can be used. One of the coalition's main goals is to promote transparency across supply chains. To achieve this, companies must understand who their direct and indirect suppliers are in order to assess current project progress and define next steps. This knowledge forms the basis for effective reporting and accountability. Members are expected to report annually using predefined indicators. For now, only elements 1, 2, and 4 of the roadmap have specific indicators in place. Since this webinar focuses primarily on DCF volumes and suppliers' engagement, we are presenting the indicators related to element 1 on supply chain, and element 2, suppliers and meat packers. Under element 1, members are encouraged to report on their commitments to forest positive goals, their time-bound action plans to achieve these commitments, and an overview of the company's beef footprint across all products categories. As you can see on KPI 1.4, members are encouraged to publish the scope of products being reported. This is very important to guarantee transparency on the DCF volumes reported. The guidance pushes for reporting on full volumes, in other words, sourced globally, and for any types of cattle-derived products. However, understanding the limitation of data, members may choose to report in a specific scope. 1.5 is to report on the volumes of non-origin, which was explained previously on this recording. Meanwhile, 1.6 reflects the percentage of volumes classified as DCF. Please note that the percentage disclosed in the letter A has to match the sum of the DCF options on letter B. It's important to note that members can also report on volumes that are progressing towards DCF, supported by specific actions, such as investments in cattle landscapes initiatives and volumes coming from engaged suppliers. Non-DCF volumes are expected to be publicly DCF volumes are not expected to be publicly reported. However, it is understandable that the difference between the summatory of DCF volumes plus the progressing towards DCF to 100% is the share related to non-DCF volumes. Moving on to element 2, the indicators focus on the publication of suppliers lists and the efforts made by members to implement and promote the forest positive approach across their supply chains. It's important to highlight that members are not obliged to report on any of the indicators. Each company has the autonomy to decide which indicators to report on and what type of information to disclose based on their own priorities and level of progress. Although it is recommended that the reporting is made as complete as possible and in best alignment with the guidance on beef roadmap implementation publicly available. Then to verification, which is something that many companies may use particularly in the context of public reporting. Within the context of the Forest Positive Coalition Beef Roadmap, evidence of compliance and verification are encouraged as best practices, but those are not required for the DCF reporting. Seeking for evidence of compliance or running a second-party auditing on suppliers' purchase control system is strongly recommended to assure the quality of claims, and therefore the FPC encourages companies to do so and be transparent about implementation of any verification action. It is worth mentioning that the Accountability Framework Initiative has operational guidance on verification that you can access. Now, we are going to talk about the types of steps and actions that a company might take for the volumes that don't fall under the DCF category. First, in a company's own supply chain, companies can work with their suppliers to effectively manage deforestation risk within supply chains by by implementing DCF control mechanisms, for example. Companies can also work with suppliers to develop a collaborative strategy to support fattening farms, to leverage management and transparency approaches, as well as potential incentives on capacity building, technical assistance, and reintegration processes to address nonconformities, including the ones in relation to deforestation and conversion. This will allow the monitoring to be expanded to more and more tiers within indirect cattle suppliers. As in the case where there is no DCF approach, volumes cannot be considered as DCF, and therefore engagement is crucial to collaboratively mitigate risks. This fits into the DCF supplier strategy within the coalition's theory of change. There is also opportunities to work beyond supply chains and beyond just the company's own suppliers. So FPC members should also consider engaging in production landscapes to collaboratively transform cattle production, which is very important since cattle raising is often linked to high deforestation rates and greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, it can also be mentioned the relevance of leveraging co-funding for landscape initiatives related to cattle supply chains in the coalition's priority origins through partnership with FPC members, suppliers, donors, and investors. Finally, the last relevant thing we want to highlight to you is where to find information on some of the resources mentioned during this recording. The CGF FPC Beef Roadmap contains FPC companies' commitments to beef and the list of KPIs to be annually reported. The guidance on the Beef Roadmap provides guidance on how to implement the Beef Roadmap and do the reporting. Meanwhile, the guidance for forest positive suppliers of cattle-derived products is focused on meat packers in Brazil and provides general guidance for suppliers. I hope you found this webinar useful. Thank you so much.